Okay. Oof. Glad to see Professor Collis's videos working. My worst fears are coming true there for a second. Thanks so much for joining us, by the way, Professor. I know it was a little late notice.
So it looks like other people are able to start joining, huh?
Yeah. Yes, folks. That's good on that end.
All right.
Oh, wow. What a virtual background.
You know, if I can't be there in person, I think we knew we tried it twice before in COVID.
Right.
So
that's nice, Jim. I am jealous that you came up with that idea.
Oh, good to see you, Steve.
Hey, you too. How you doing?
Good. We got to catch up.
Yeah, for sure. James, did you see that email from Stephanie or Professor Barclay she just sent?
No, I'll look at that right now. By the way, while I'm looking at that, do you go with the German pronunciation? Do you go with Sana or do you go with Sane?
Sonny rhymes with John. That's the easiest way to.
All right, perfect.
Remember it.
Okay.
Jim, your background is making me want to be in Provo.
Me too.
I miss the mountains. So how are you doing with the weather there in Bay Area?
Doing all right. We're it was pretty smoky, and the saddest part of it all was I don't know if I told you, our son who had leukemia when he was young, we go to this camp every summer for families of kids that had cancer. It's a beautiful thing. It's just sort of a great time. Anyway, it burned down with the fires near Oroville. Really, really tragic.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. So it's pretty crazy.
Weather
otherwise is good. Hey, Stephanie.
Oh, good.
Hey, Stephanie.
Good to see you.
You too.
James?
How's it going? It's good to see you. I took Professor Barclay's class. I'm a big fan.
James was a star student.
Welcome to the club.
It's good to have you in class, James.
Thanks. Yeah, I really have missed your classes, but I'm so glad that you could join us virtually. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to wait a little bit as people will continue to trickle through for the next little while.
Okay.
We've had the settings so they'll come in muted, and so it won't disrupt the event.
Is it just us right now that are talking?
Yeah, it's just us right now.
Okay.
We're playing around with different settings because I know that from you as a presenter
even though
standpoint.
it says there's 28 participants, it's just us.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So you as the panelists will be able to see each other's videos, and you'll be defaulted unmuted. The attendees come in unmuted so they can join from wherever they are with their videos off. So they are watching, they are attending. That said, towards the end, we'll open things up for questions, and then we can turn things on so they can actually ask you questions.
Okay, so we will not see anyone but ourselves. Is that what you're saying when we're talking?
Yeah, 1 second. Hey, oh yeah, so we just confirmed everyone's able to see, so it's going well.
Good thing we weren't doing anything embarrassing.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We have a trifecta of religious liberty scholars today. Somewhere there are some anti-religious liberty people who are shaking in their boots knowing that we're having this conference today. So I'm really excited to have these great speakers. We'll start with Professor James Sonne. We've tried to get him out here a couple of times, so we're grateful we finally are able to hear from him today. He's a professor at Stanford at the Religious Liberty Clinic, and he's the leading and only full-time academic program in the country where students can learn and practice the profession of law through supervised litigation in that field. He's an experienced and award-winning teacher, practitioner, scholar with particular expertise in law and religious issues. He earned his BA with honors from Duke University and his JD with honors from Harvard Law School. He's a former law clerk to Judge Edith Brown Clement of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. Sonne also previously served as associate professor of law at Ave Maria School of Law in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as an appellate lawyer at Horvitz and Levy in Los Angeles, and as a labor and employment lawyer at McGuire Woods in Richmond, Virginia. He is very well published. He's written full-length articles in Clinical Law Review, Notre Dame Law Review, Georgia Law Review, and other shorter pieces as well in Harvard Law Review, Oxford Journal, and many others. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor Sonne. Professor, thank you. Professor Barclay is going to be joining us as two panelists, one of two panelists. Both she and Professor Collis will be giving some reactions and adding some other thoughts after Professor Sonne's remarks. Professor Barclay is a hero of mine and I consider a good friend. She has joined teaching at the Notre Dame Law School as of this year, and her research focuses on the role of our different democratic institutions play in protecting minority rights, particularly at the intersection of free speech and religious exercise. Her writing has also been published or is forthcoming in the Harvard Law Review, Washington University Law Review, Notre Dame Law Review, Boston College Law Review. And she has been frequently appeared discussing First Amendment issues on BBC, World News, Wall Street Journal Live, and Fox News. Her work has also been featured in other media outlets such as New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. Prior to joining Notre Dame faculty, Professor Barclay, of course, was an associate professor of law at BYU Law, where she was twice voted Professor of the Year by her second and third year students, me being one among them. She has worked with the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. It represented many organizations and individuals, including before the Supreme Court. And she worked at Covington before she taught there. She was nominated to serve as the chair-elect for the AALS Law and Religion section and the subcommittee chair for the J. Reuben Clark Law Society International Religious Freedom Committee. She graduated summa cum laude from BYU Law School, where she was elected to the Order of the Coif. She clerked for Honorable Randy Smith on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and will be joining the Supreme Court next year. And then Professor Collis is our other panelist who will be responding with Professor Barclay. He researches and teaches on religion and law and other First Amendment topics, and is the founding faculty director of the Beck Laughlin First Amendment Center and of the Texas's Law and Religion Clinic. On the topic of religious freedom law, he is a sought-after speaker to academic and lay audiences across the United States, including foreign diplomats from countries in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and South America on behalf of the United States State Department. He has been interviewed and quoted in various news and media outlets, including the Deseret News, Washington Times, Salt Lake Tribune, the Denver Business Journal, Law Week Colorado, and many others. His scholarly work has also appeared in the Michigan Law Review, the Nebraska Law Review, University of Denver Law Review online. Also his book, Deep Conviction, which brings life to the history of free exercise law in the United States for lay audiences. Prior to joining Texas, Stephen was the Olin Darling Research Fellow at the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law. He began his career as an equity partner at Holland and Hart LLP, where he chaired the firm's nationwide religious institutions and First Amendment practice group. He also graduated magna cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School, where he was elected to the Order of the Coif, and served as editor on the Michigan Law Review and the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. Thank you so very much. He also completed his undergraduate studies with university honors at Brigham Young University, so it's always fun to have another alum join us. Thank you so very much. I know it's not the same right now. We would be giving you a roaring BYU round of applause, but mine will have to do for now. And with that, we very much look forward to hearing from each of you, and I'll turn the time over to Professor Sonne. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, James. It's great to be with you all. And as James mentioned, we tried to put this event together, I think twice last year in the spring, and because of COVID, it didn't work out, but I figured the least I could do is put up a background of your beautiful law school. So it's great to be with you virtually. Thanks to the Federalist Society for putting on the event, and to my dear friends, Stephanie and Steve, for joining me on today's panel. It really is a dream come true for me, both professionally and personally, for them to join me here as fellow founders of religious liberty clinics. It really is a wonderful story of what's happening at law schools across the country, not only at Stanford and Texas and Notre Dame, but now Harvard, Yale, and hopefully after this call, BYU as well will have a budding program in the area. So it's great to be with you all. I'm especially pleased too to talk to you today about the topic, which is religious liberty, the heart of pluralism. As a director of a program that litigates in this space, I'm often asked to talk about the latest hot button issue or controversy in the field. But much of what I want to leave you with today, and in keeping with this theme of pluralism, and for that matter, the heart of it. Focus is less on the law and more on what could increasingly be seen in our society generally, that really culture is paramount, and in both the troubles we face in the field and their likely solutions. And I think as we'll explore today, the programs that Stephanie, Steve, and I are running are really trying to get, yes, in many ways, legal solutions, yes, teaching students, but even more importantly, addressing the cultural challenge that we face in this field. Because when we see it, the headlining controversies in our field, most of the room's energy tends to be sucked up by political fights and entrenched factions. Nothing's new, and that's true in a lot of areas, but particularly in religious liberty, and that's particularly, I think, concerning. From culture wars cases to the travel ban litigation, the focus has been less on conscience and public policy and more on abortion, same-sex marriage, immigration, identity politics, and the like. These are, of course, important issues. They all call for thoughtful leadership, cooperation, resolution. But either because of their scorching heat or the loss of a wider understanding of the distinct value of religious liberty, I see an acute need, especially in the academy, to return to first principles and renew and broaden an appreciation for religious liberty as what it truly is, which is making space for each and every human being to decide for herself or himself the matter of religion and its practice in their lives. A deeply personal and deeply important norm that has prevailed throughout our country's history, and we need to, I think, refocus and rededicate our efforts to rediscovering it in many ways. Based on my work in the trenches in the clinic, I can tell you that this hyper-political winner-take-all styling of the field that you see in the media and in other, and frankly on all sides, you see most religious liberty disputes don't have to do with those hot-button controversies. Most of them just have to do with people and communities trying to live, work, and serve amid various strains of challenge, whether that be pluralism itself, right, trying to work things out together in community, the rise of the administrative state, again, for better or worse, the tensions are going to arise, and of course, secularism, the rise of the nuns, whatever you want to call it, the challenges of making what is sacred to the believer relevant to the non-believer. All of those challenges combine to threaten people by faith and by extension, I would say everyone, of the welcome that we have traditionally, even if imperfectly, afforded in our First Amendment and civil rights tradition. I think I can speak for Stephanie and Steve in saying the goal in our clinics is to recapture the theme of protection for the small, still voice of conscience that we all share, and to show that religious liberty is not only an indispensable right that needs well-trained, professionally competent lawyers, the kind of stuff that we do in teaching students the practice of, and profession of law, but it's also universal and we hope uniting cultural value that belongs to everyone. In many ways, religious liberty is seen as a problem, but I would actually propose that it is a solution to many of the ills that befall us as a culture, many things that divide us. It actually is a vent, if you will, where we can all look at together what are the values that we at least hold in common such that we can make space for their exploration, debate, and bridge building and mutual respect. So how do we do this in our clinics, and what are some broader lessons? I want to share with you a few examples. As James noted, the clinics Stephanie, Steve, and I run, we're dedicated to teaching law students in and through religious liberty litigation. We're first and foremost, the programs that we run for our students that are clinical are really about representing real clients in real disputes under our supervision, of course. So we handle, just as you would in a legal aid clinic, we're handling live cases, but all of our cases concern the issue of religious liberty in various settings. Through that enterprise, we of course have a direct impact on our students, right, in terms of teaching them how to be a lawyer, the nuts and bolts of how to be a lawyer. And yes, it is true that religious liberty, goes throughout all of our work, but our students quickly understand in the first day or two that this isn't just some theoretical abstract exercise. This is about helping a real person in a real situation. And to do that as lawyers, you got to know your procedure, you got to know your rules, you got to know what it is to be and act like a lawyer. And that we think is a particularly great thing for religious liberty to help, but also a great way, frankly, to learn transferable skills to serve a client and to, and develop those. Most of our students likely won't go into this field; they'll go into some other field, but certainly through the experience, they will grow and learn. On the religious liberty side, of course, though, not only do we help our clients, we also, I think, can spotlight this universal norm that I was talking about. That's really about human dignity, and that's at the heart of religious liberty, not simply culture war fights and the like. To these ends, to give you our sense of what we would do at Stanford, we focus on 3 areas: prison litigation, employment cases, and contexts involving humanitarian aid, social service. We think that these 3 areas, aside from providing transferable lessons and skills, also provide this reminder of the broader cultural reality. Religious liberty is about concrete situations. It's about people. Most of our clients aren't thinking broadly about what their case means for the cause of religious liberty. They just want to live, survive, serve, work in a manner consistent with their deeply held religious beliefs, nothing more, nothing less. And as we've seen in our work in the last 8 years, I can see sort of 3 dynamics from our experience that are applied broadly. If you look at our clinics as sort of a microcosm, a laboratory, if you will, what are the dynamics that work to advance greater peace in our field and help rebuild religious liberty? Well, as a cultural norm, I would suggest 3. First is universal religious liberty for all. Religious liberty is not limited to a particular perspective, belief, set of practices, but it belongs to everyone as a matter of human dignity. So universality. Secondly, a focus on real people and solutions. Religious liberty at bottom for our clients is really about people, ultimately. As the founder of the Beckett Fund, Seamus Hassan, has famously said, religious liberty is not about who God is, it is about who we are as human beings. So the human dimension. And finally, a balanced recognition of what it means to accommodate one another in a pluralistic society. So universality, human situations, and accommodation. So to take these 3 in turn briefly, first and perhaps most importantly, we represent clients of all faiths. I think that's true at all 3 of our programs. In the past few years at Stanford, for example, we've represented Sikh truck drivers who were fired for refusing to trim their beards. Unshorn hair is a very sacred practice in the Sikh faith. We represent a Jehovah's Witness who was denied a job for the government because she refused to take a loyalty oath. Jehovah's Witnesses are pacifists and also, are not particularly fond of loyalty oaths or anything that would put themselves between them and their faith. We represent Muslim and Jewish inmates who are denied religious meals in prison or the right to wear head coverings, a kippah or a kufi. And we also represented Christians who are called to provide humanitarian aid to migrants. So if you look at this collection of cases, and I'm happy to answer questions about these in the Q&A, we take a religious liberty for all approach, right? We represent all faiths. I personally think that's the right thing to do, not just out of principle, but also to teach future lawyers who are trying to represent anyone in their future careers. It's an important lesson in cross-cultural learning and client-centered lawyering. So it's an important professional enterprise. But also, religious liberty for all and to the present issue of pluralism shows in a concrete and transparent way the uniting reality that religious liberty and its challenges are not, again, unique to a particular faith or even to religion itself, but belong to everyone. When you look at this list of cases, your head might spin and say, oh, I didn't know religious liberty included that situation or this situation or the other situation, or that faith or this faith. And you suddenly realize, oh, actually, it's a common theme throughout. There's sort of no corner that's left untouched by the principle. And by shining that light on all those corners, you're able to see, oh, well, then maybe it matters to me. Maybe it matters to my friends, to my community, even if it doesn't I don't face these challenges every day. So that's universality. The next dynamic I want to talk about is the human dimension. Reminding people that religious liberty applies in real, concrete, and personally meaningful ways. We make religious liberty a tangible and accessible reality through real people rather than abstract theories or hypothetical controversies. A lot of times I'm asked, would you take this type of case or this hypothetical, or what would you do in this situation? And oftentimes my response is just, well, let's look at the situations where these things actually occur. They occur in real time. They occur in real human relationships, often relationships that are broken and need healing, need good lawyering and counseling in that process. So focusing on real people and real situations, I think, really helps shift the narrative in a way that is, I think, a critical salve to our challenge in breaking through barriers where folks just don't want to talk about this issue, or they have an instant negative reaction. So rather than getting caught in culture wars controversies, again, controversies that are worth debating, discussing, and all of that is a matter of substance. But as a matter of religious liberty, at least from my perspective, we need to think about new ways to talk about this and to reach folks who aren't already on board. And how do you do that? You do that through not just the technique, but also what ultimately is the reality, which is that religious liberty really is not about abstract controversy, but rather is a uniting and really perennial struggle of marginalized people who hold beliefs that may be in tension with the majority, and they're struggling to live in a pluralistic society without compromising what's most sacred to them. And that struggle, as my colleague Michael McConnell has often said, counts for something. It's got to count for something, that there's this real struggle out there, that it's not just a bunch of academics sitting around a room talking about these ideas in theory. There are real people in real situations. So we think we're making inroads in our clinic by, for example, we won a recent case of the Ninth Circuit for a small homeless ministry. Again, yes, they care about religiously broadly, but they were pretty much just there to help people. That's all they wanted to do, and to do that in a manner consistent with their faith. Right now, we're representing a death row inmate in Alabama who's seeking a spiritual advisor of his own faith to be at his side at the time of execution. We're helping a store clerk in inner city Los Angeles who's trying to balance her need to provide for her family with her commitment as a Seventh-day Adventist to the Saturday Sabbath. These are deeply human and I think accessible stories. Whatever your position on zoning rules or at-will employment or the death penalty, right? These are areas where we can sort of bring people together and propose, surely we can agree that something can be worked out to honor not only human beings in these situations, but also ourselves in the process. Even in the prison context, the Dostoevsky line about, you could tell the health of a society by looking inside its prison walls. And so these sorts of things are important, not just to our clients, but more broadly. And by proposing these situations, by helping to resolve them, we can build a common language and experience. We can bring a diverse group of voices together and explore these ideas together. And then in the process, hopefully, maybe then we can turn to tackle some of the more thorny issues. But we're really trying to, in many ways, start from scratch. And where do we start? It really is with the human person, rather than just starting and finishing in our partisan corners. So lastly, I think the issue of what it means to accommodate is really important. So in all of our work, we encourage our students, not to just pound their fist on the table and declare the rights of their clients, but really get to understand what is the situation we're dealing with. How can we resolve the problem? What are the interests that the prison system may have? What are the interests and concerns that an employer might have? What are the issues that neighbors might have with a neighborhood homeless ministry? Yes, sometimes there's bigotry. Yes, sometimes there's outright hostility. But oftentimes there's just an ignorance or a ships passing in the night or a cross-cultural misunderstanding that really can be solved if you put in the work and rather than just running to the microphones, for the latest press release. And when we look at these cases and we think about them in a creative problem-solving way, we really find that you can build bridges, you can solve problems. We resolve, many of our cases in an amicable way once we're there, once we can communicate and express the interests of our clients who often are voiceless without us. And we really can show in that process a balanced solution that really recognizes that accommodation is a good thing, that welcoming one another is a good thing. It's not some exception to the rule, it is the rule. Brett Scharf's there at BYU talks a lot about this. Think about for accommodation, it's gotten this sort of reputation as, oh, special rules for religious people. No. It's a question of honoring and respecting one another and our full humanity. And that's truly equal opportunity. That's true equality, as well as liberty. Now, in closing, I although I'm optimistic, I also do think that we do have a broader challenge. And in speaking to a faith-based school, I'm sure you're well aware of this. And that is, how do you communicate about religious liberty to a culture that might not necessarily have a deep appreciation for the goodness of religion, right? The religious liberty matters. It tends to matter more to people who practice religion because it affects them, right? It's sort of that's unsurprising and unremarkable. And as John Garvey, president of Catholic University, said recently, our society won't care about religious freedom if it doesn't care about God. So my purpose for this talk is not a theological one. And wherever that goes, and wherever your perspective is on that spectrum, I'm not here to debate, but what I am here to say is I want to flag the issue that it really is important, I think, to think of different ways, not just faith-based ways, to talk about this issue, to make it relevant to folks who don't necessarily share your perspective or mine. That we really shouldn't be thinking in narrow terms, but in broad terms and in human terms. And through that process, I think we can make some progress and show that religious liberty is not something that just belongs to people of faith, but it's an important universal principle. And to that end, even making those decisions is something that we need to protect. Bob Cochran of Pepperdine, when he gave a talk and when we founded our clinic years ago, he said, if there's a God, finding and obeying him or her is probably the most important thing people do on this earth. So making room for that small, still voice, making room for diverse perspectives, figuring out how do we talk about these issues in a way that resonates. That's what we're trying to do in these programs. I think we've had some success. I think if you look at it as a laboratory, the diversity of students that we've been able to attract, the attention that we've been able to achieve to the issue, the problems we've helped solve for our clients, and I think also the lowering of the temperature to give us our own space, right, to be able to communicate these abiding values has been a real blessing and something that we're excited to share with you today. So with that, I will turn it over to my other panelists, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. So I don't know if either of you want to jump in and start talking. I guess we'll just kind of have informal time, or if you'd prefer to each have a block of time, whatever you prefer.
If you want to go next, I think my BYU students have, folks who know me, and I think they're more eager to hear from the new voice.
I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm happy to go and offer my thoughts. And James, if I go on too long for the allotted time, slap me down. First of all, I want to thank you and BYU Law and the BYU Federalist Society for hosting us. It's a little bit strange not being able to see the faces of the participants, so I apologize to all of them out there. But let me just say how thrilled I am to be speaking alongside both Professor Sonne and Professor Barclay, who are just dear friends and mentors in many ways for me, and have both had an extreme influence in my life. I really appreciate everything Jim had to say about the importance of clinics and the role that they can play in helping people understand truly the breadth of religious freedom and how many people's lives it impacts. We are in the midst right now at the University of Texas Law School of launching a clinic, a religious freedom clinic. And one of the things we have found right out of the gate, and this was not a surprise, is that most people have no understanding of what religious freedom is. They know it only in the context of what they hear on the news, which tends to only report on it when there's a big culture war case. What that ends up doing is ignoring somewhere in the range of 98% of the cases that have absolutely nothing to do with culture war issues. And I use the word cases. I suspect the percentage is actually quite a bit higher if I were to expand it out, instead of saying religious freedom cases, to say just religious freedom matters. Instances where small churches and prison inmates and school students are struggling to live out their faith, and for one reason or another, government is getting in the way, or an employer is getting in the way. Many of those don't ever materialize into actual disputes, but they nevertheless are matters that need to get resolved. And of course, none of that ever gets reported in the press. So I'm very thankful for what Jim had to say on that. I wanted to give a little background about myself and how I got into this. What I find many people today, especially in academia, but also among practitioners who get into religious freedom, they tend to do it because they were driven by some other issue, often one of the culture war issues. And then that's kind of tends to be what their focus is. I was a little bit different. That wasn't the case for me. I didn't know anything about law and religion, and I got into the subject by happenstance. I happened to be at Michigan when a very prominent law professor named Doug Laycock was there. He was only there for a short time, and we overlapped. And I took his class on a whim. And all I can say is that it was kind of like discovering a vast cavern that you could never stop exploring by accident, right? Like I stumbled upon it and then realized that I could spend the rest of my life exploring its turns and its new discoveries and its hidden secrets. And I could do it for the rest of my career, and I'd never get tired of it. And that's what I felt like in that class, along with a couple other First Amendment classes I took. And for me, what has happened is, as I have explored religious freedom and now have the opportunity to teach it to students, I have become consumed by one very broad question. And I acknowledge it is a very broad question, but the broad question for me is, how do people of very, very different and sometimes opposite religious beliefs thrive alongside one another in peace in the same society? And I emphasize, I don't mean live alongside one another, but how do you create a legal regime where they can thrive alongside one another? That question is something that humanity has really struggled to answer. And most countries have failed to really give any type of satisfactory solution. I think the United States has done a decent job, but certainly we haven't done a perfect job. And I will probably spend the rest of my career trying to answer that question and its many sub-questions, and hopefully bring us a little bit closer to a solution. And the clinic, as Professor Sonne points out, a religious freedom clinic is a great way to do that, because it forces students to, one, go out and put themselves in the shoes of people who are very different from them. So it helps them overcome this very natural human tendency to want to protect only themselves. And it also allows them to see, as Professor Sonne said, just how much religious freedom protects so many of us, even when we don't really realize it's happening. Today's issues that get all the attention in the media really do have to do with the culture wars. And I would just briefly say that for me, I like to reframe those issues, and I'll just talk about this briefly. I do not approach any question that arises on in the national spotlight with an end result in mind. Most people I know, including in academia, tend to have an end result in mind, and they reason backwards from it to justify whatever legal rule they're calling for. Now, that's entirely appropriate if you're an advocate in a case. But as a policy matter, I'm not sure that's always the best approach. For me, when I think of the culture war cases, I frame it differently. I have a question, again, that I'm trying to ask, and it's a variant of the broader question that drives me, except it's much more specific into this one singular area of the law. I'm trying to ask the question, of how do we avoid, at the same time, two historic wrongs. One of those historic wrongs is refusing people equal access to goods and services and to equal protection under the law. And that's something that our country and many countries have struggled with. And the second historic wrong is denying people their livelihoods and equal protection under the law because of their religious beliefs. That also is a historic and odious wrong that we don't want to repeat. And it goes back centuries. We see theists have done it to atheists. Atheists have tried to do it to theists, have done it to theists successfully. The English Test Acts prevented Catholics from holding all sorts of positions, including as solicitors and barristers and teachers in any profession that required 2 or more apprentices. We see it, Protestants have done it to Catholics, Catholics have done it to Protestants, Muslims to Christians, and Christians to Muslims across the globe. It's an oft repeated wrong. How do we resolve those two, or how do we create a legal regime that prevents repeating those two wrongs? Most people I know tend to focus on only correcting one of those wrongs and tend to ignore the other one. And I will admit, I will confess that it's not an easy answer to the question. I had one of my law students once in a class said, well, in my opinion, one side should always win. I said, okay, so you're comfortable then going to someone and telling them you cannot pursue a particular career, perhaps the only career you know how to do because of your religious beliefs. And the student got this wide-eyed look and she said, well, when you put it that way, no, I don't want to tell anybody that. And I said, but yes, but that's the solution you've proposed. How do you come up with a solution that can actually prevent both wrongs from occurring? I have thoughts on that, but for lack of time, I won't get into them today, in part because I'm convinced that some of the solutions I have will actually upset people on both the left and the right and leave me on an island by myself. The good news about being on an island by yourself is you can shoot in any direction and hit somebody. But I won't go into it today. What I will emphasize is this, is that what Professor Sonne talked about, the principles he talked about, I am certain are how we get to a solution. So I would encourage those students who are listening as they think about trying to live in a world where you can actually protect people and allow people of very different beliefs to thrive alongside one another. Ask yourself if you are applying those principles that Jim talked about. Respecting human dignity, finding a mutual respect for other people and for those people who may disagree with you, wanting to see a country where pluralism can thrive. Most religious freedom cases, as I've said, have absolutely nothing to do with the culture wars. But I do think those other 99% of cases that we so rarely hear about, but that are so important, actually can help us reach a solution on the culture war matters. Because the same question animates them that animates the cases you hear about so often in the media. And it's, how do people of very different beliefs thrive alongside one another? How do we make that happen? I think clinics are a great way of teaching that, and understanding that religious freedom truly does protect every single one of us is another way of understanding it as well. And with that, I'll pass it over to Professor Barclay.
So first of all, thank you to James and to the Federalist Society and BYU for hosting us. It's great to get to be here virtually with you all, even though I miss being there with you in person. And it's a real treat to get to be here with Jim and Steve. Jim has really pioneered this field. He's blazed a really powerful trail in clinical education for students in religious liberty. And Steve and I are both benefiting from his really important work in this area. Steve's doing really important work at University of Texas, and I'm excited to see more what comes out of his center and clinic. So I'm just going to talk really quick about some of these themes that I agree with that I guess I should call them Professor Collis and Professor Sonne have been talking about, with pluralism and living together with different views in peace, and how the Supreme Court in this last term really, I think, emphasized and was advancing the ball on these important principles. This was really, this last term had it all. Blockbuster opinions, a presidential impeachment trial, a global pandemic that changed all of the procedures and necessitated oral arguments by telephone. And my personal favorite highlight, the toilet flushing that we heard in the background, which may or may not have been one of the justices themselves. So, fascinating term. And amid all this turmoil, there was one area of the law where the justices seemed to be weaving together a set of precedents in a way that is nurturing this idea of how do we live together with differences in peace? How do we have a pluralistic society where we can thrive and each have our dignity? So in the term before that, in American Legion, a 7-justice majority emphasized that the religion clauses of the Constitution aim to foster a society in which all people of all beliefs can live together harmoniously. That's the point of the religion clauses, is to give us that sort of harmony and peace despite our deep differences. So this last term we saw Bostock. This was a case where the court expanded protections for sexual orientation and gender identity under Title VII. But in doing so, the court reminded us that there's still going to be a lot of protection for groups dealing with different religious beliefs about some of those issues. And the free exercise clause lies at the heart of our pluralistic society. The justices were deeply concerned about preserving this promise of free exercise of religion. They pointed to Title VII's religious exemptions and RFRA itself as a kind of super statute that also offers important protections in this space. We had Espinoza, another powerful victory for pluralism in both historic and present day terms. Espinoza was really walking back some historic Blaine amendments that were created precisely to force an immigrant minority to conform to majority's religious and cultural views. And in the modern era, these Blaine amendments were being used in different states to force religious groups to relinquish their religious characters, usually religious character that is unpopular. And Espinoza rejected both that historic discrimination and bigotry that was taking place, and it precluded the government from imposing this sort of conformity on religious groups moving forward. It called that odious to the Constitution. In Our Lady Guadalupe, we saw the court reaffirm that different types of religious groups get to choose their religious leaders. And the court talked about how a rule that the Ninth Circuit was trying to promote would be really bad for minority religious groups like Muslim groups, who might define their religious leaders in ways that are different from what is mainstream and more typical in the types of parlance we use for religious leaders, and that we shouldn't ignore those religious minority views just because we might know less about them. We also saw the court rule on the Little Sisters of the Poor case, where the court again affirmed that government can find ways to promote important policies like expanding contraception coverage, and that we can do so without having unnecessary conflicts where we're requiring that coverage to be expanded on the backs of groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor. There are ways that we can do both. There doesn't need to be a fight, is what the Supreme Court was emphasizing again in this case. This is the Little Sisters' third time to the Supreme Court, I believe. Why are these things valuable? Why is it important matter? Do I think that what the trajectory of the Supreme Court has been a positive one for our country, for pluralism? Let me just discuss a few reasons why I think this ideal of being able to have a live and let live society is really important. One is just purely as an instrumental and empirical matter. When we let people have more religious freedom, it reduces conflict, it reduces human suffering. Studies that compare countries around the world find that countries with more religious freedom have less conflict. It provides an important safety valve where people are able to not feel like they have to turn to more egregious sorts of avenues when their core beliefs are being threatened. It also, just on a more individual level, this goes to some of what Jim was talking about with his important stories, it reduces unnecessary human suffering for individuals. One story I like to talk about is the story of Mary Steinemetz, who in Kansas died for her faith because she could not receive a religious accommodation in the 21st century. Because she's a Jehovah's Witness, she was asking for a bloodless liver transfusion. It actually would have been cheaper than some of the procedures that the medical insurance in that state provided. They just needed to work with a different type of provider to get it. But because stubborn bureaucrats didn't want to provide religious freedom and didn't want to provide an exception, they said no. She eventually won her case in court on a lot of the principles that we're talking about, but by then it was too late and her medical condition was too far advanced. And I think hers is an important warning story of what happens when we don't value religious freedom enough, and when we aren't being on our guard about protecting against needless suffering. Religious freedom, I think, is also valuable because it serves as a canary in the mine shaft, if you will, for being an early warning signal when government is encroaching too much on any of our freedoms, not just religious freedom. But when government power is encroaching on individual liberty across the board, it is often the case that religious people are guarding those rights most jealously, and they're going to be some of the first ones to notice when those rights are being impinged upon, because they are often exercising those rights on a daily basis in a really particular way, and they covet that ability to do so in a way that we might sometimes take for granted or not notice some of our other freedoms. And that warning signal, that canary in the mine shaft, can let us know when government is taking too much of freedom away for everyone. And sort of, along these lines, protecting this principle enhances everyone's human dignity. It gives people the freedom carved out from government power, the space to pursue truth, whether that truth takes them to a place of faith or of none at all. It's a freedom that everyone should be concerned about. And at BYU in particular, one of the ways that I think we can do more to advance that sort of freedom is prioritizing, advocating, and speaking up for religious freedom of people not of the same faith as ours. We can't say LDS anymore. Not of our Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint faith. And Joseph Smith himself defended Muslim religious beliefs and advocated the principle of religious liberty for everyone. We can do the same. We can speak up when we see our Native American, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Catholic, evangelical, or otherwise brothers and sisters suffering because of some rule or law that might be burdening them, even if it's not burdening us. Our 11th article of faith encourages us to do precisely this, when it says we claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all men the same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. So this is a principle that not only matters to our country for a lot of reasons, but I think at BYU in particular has real special significance. And that's one of the reasons why I'm glad to get to chat with you all about it for a few minutes today. James, back over to you, and I guess we're going to do questions soon.
Thank you all so much. In the words of Judge Bork, this has been an intellectual feast for sure. So I appreciate this time that we've had to learn from each of you. So thank you so much, Professors Sonne, Barclay, and Collis. This really has been a fantastic event, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. Before we now, just everyone in the audience, so you know how this will go, you can either raise your hand virtually and I can enable you to ask your question, or you can submit a question in the Q&A and I will make sure that you get to talk. While we're waiting for some of you to ask your questions, just want to give a brief reminder that thank you all for staying for the remainder of the event. Expect in your inboxes to shortly receive a DoorDash voucher, which we will send either today or tomorrow. So thank you so much. We'll be raffling those out. And to join us next week. So next week on the, I'll get the exact date for you. Actually, our next event will be on October 1st. And that will be with Professor Shennewerk, with our own Professor Van Workham. We'll be talking about amateur athletes' freedom of expression. So make sure to come join us next week. I don't see anyone has any questions quite yet, but we'll give a couple seconds. And I have there's two attendees who've raised their hands. So I want to start with Ashley Burton. I'll allow you to talk, and then Christopher Melling's next in the queue.
Hi, thank you so much, panelists. Wonderful. Professor Collins, I really am interested by this idea that some of the cases that you have handled in your clinic can provide maybe, that don't have to do with culture wars, can provide us with answers as we do address issues that arise in the culture war. So I would just love to hear maybe an example or two that were really meaningful for you in the practice that you felt could provide maybe some help as we address some of those more controversial issues.
Well, the only thing I want to emphasize there is that, you know, the same questions, you could take almost all of these cases and remove the facts, and I think you'd almost always find the same pattern. And by these cases, let me be clear. I generally am talking about free exercise clause cases or free exercise cases and not establishment clause cases, but you almost always find the same pattern. And that is that government and the majority who have power pass some type of law or regulation that doesn't burden most people's religious exercise. If it did, it wouldn't have passed in the first place. But it does burden some people's religious exercise, and it can burden, that can often be a very small group, or it sometimes could be a larger group, but whatever it is, it's a group that didn't have enough power to stop the law or regulation when it was being passed. So it burdens this group. They then seek for an exemption. And generally the fourth step of this is that those people who want to oppose the exemption declare that if it's granted, it will be the end of society as we know it. And I'm not saying that as a joke. That's usually the argument that gets made. And in fact, one night I was giving a speech and I made that point that the argument is often if you grant this religious exemption, it'll be the end of society as we know it. And the person who was following me actually quoted or used as kind of the outline for his arguments an article from Linda Greenhouse in the New York Times that literally described granting religious exemptions as resulting in the end of society as we know it. You usually see that exact same pattern again and again and again. And I've seen that with regulations regarding prisoners. I've seen that with regulations regarding, refusing to give a Muslim community center in the Denver metro area the zoning that they needed to operate on the same terms as a YMCA. I've seen that with churches who want to provide food and shelter to homeless, where a regulation isn't burdening anyone else in the area, but it's burdening this particular church. And in every instance, what you find is these entities are then asking for religious exemptions or accommodations to allow them to act out their faith. So that same pattern, in my experience, applies again and again and again. And if Professor Sonne or Professor Barclay have other thoughts or disagree with that, I welcome hearing what they have to say. But that's kind of what I meant by that. And I guess my point is, if we can make accommodations work in these other areas where government has interests, and they're not illegitimate interests, they're trying to solve a problem. If we can find solutions in all those other areas, then perhaps we can find them in these big culture war areas as well. We can use the same strategies and the same type of thinking in these other not so hot button areas and try to apply the same mindset and thinking to the more hot button areas.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to turn to the next question. Looks like we have time for two more. So we'll start with Christopher if you want to ask yours, and then we'll go to Spencer.
Great. I just wish we had more than an hour. Okay, so this could be addressed to anybody, primarily to Professor Sonne. So this past June 2nd, the president signed the executive order on advancing international religious freedom. And until I searched for it, because I was searching something else just now, I hadn't heard a word from it from the media. I can only suspect that's because politics, especially anything that comes from the president's office these days, is discounted. Can you just speak to, are you seeing continued kind of pushback from whether politics or the perception that it's only right-wing Christian groups that are promoting religious freedom? Are y'all seeing a barrier from politics or perceptions to all the great work that you're trying to do? Thank you.
I think that's, politics is always in the background, but I think in many ways we are either maybe purposefully or not purposely sort of blissfully ignorant to the politics. Like we basically have I think a happy warrior, if you will, almost I don't know how you would describe it, but our approach really in focusing on the human person and the work that we do. Yes, we take into account politics. Yes, oftentimes some of our clients would say, well, I never wanted to actually rely on RFRA because I thought that was just for Hobby Lobby. I didn't know it actually would apply to homeless ministries or helping migrants in the desert or that sort of thing. And so, yes, it's always in the back, and the politics is always in the background. But we found that I think if you just focus on the person, and if you just focus on the particular problem, that's in play, you can kind of melt away some of the external noise. And yes, it's always going to be there. But in training any advocate, you have to prepare them to solve problems in any environment. And so I'd say for the most part, it's in the background. It's something that we pay attention to. But I think for many reasons, it's a good thing, I think, just to kind of just push through it and show this is an important value in season and out of season. When we were started the first week of our clinic, a New York Times reporter followed us around, which was a little nerve-wracking. But and at one point, he had a session with the students, and he was pressing them on their own religious and political background, which I didn't think was terribly appropriate, but maybe interesting to readers. What kind of student takes this clinic? And I remember one of our students, kind of in exasperation, saying, "I don't even know why you keep asking me if I'm a conservative, Republican, Christian. I used to be a Seventh-day Adventist. Don't tell my grandmother that. Please don't quote me on that. I'm a Democrat. I voted for President Obama. If this was the night you're asking me in 2012, about why did I sign up for this conservative clinic? If this was the 60s, you'd ask me, why did I sign up for this liberal clinic?" The principle remains throughout the ages and throughout the politics. And it's something that we sort of keep a focused eye on. Yes, we keep our ear out for the politics, but it doesn't slow us down, and in fact inspires us to try and find ways either around it or through that. And yes, international religious freedom is a critical thing. In many ways, the issues that our clients face, though of vital importance to them, can often sort of seem small when you compare it to the martyrdom and to the grave suffering that folks overseas face. So I think religious freedom is definitely something that international religious freedom, we definitely have to keep it in mind. You have a great center there that focuses on that. There's so much work to be done. What we can do, though, is I think at a sort of intellectual level, to be sort of the beacon of light for religious liberty, is to do the work that we do, and hopefully share those lessons around the world.
I love Jim's point about, in the 60s, you would have been joining the liberal clinic, not the conservative clinic, because, religious freedom hasn't always been politicized in the way that it is now. When RFRA was passed after Employment Division versus Smith, so in 1993, it was passed nearly unanimously. It had sponsors who were Democrats and Republicans. This was not a deeply politicized issue, and I don't think it should be. And so politicians want to try and politicize it. I think it's to our benefit to try and push back on that. So at my work at Beckett, before being a professor, I often felt like we were doing our job right if from time to time we were ticking off people on both sides of the aisle, and from time to time we were making people on both sides of the aisle be happy. So when we had a lawsuit where we were suing the military because they weren't accommodating Sikhs in the military who wanted to wear a beard and turban, Republicans weren't all thrilled about that case, right? And when we had other lawsuits defending groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor, sometimes, unfortunately, people on the other side of the aisle were not always in agreement with that either. But one thing that we try to point out is that the principle is the same. Like the actors may have changed, the stories may be a little different, but the principle is the same, and we can't defend that principle in an even-handed way. If we don't defend it in an even-handed way, then the principle is meaningless. It just becomes protection for those in power and not the vulnerable groups that really are going to need that protection the most.
And if I could just add on the politics of this, one thing that was interesting for me is I was in Colorado when the Masterpiece Cake Shop case was going up and getting decided at the Supreme Court. And then that was also when a lot of churches were deciding to provide sanctuary. And what I found fascinating is that all the people on the left were blasting Masterpiece Cake Shop and its owner, Jack Phillips, for using religious freedom principles to try to protect themselves. And all the people on the right were blasting these sanctuary churches for using religious freedom principles to try to practice, to protect their religious practice of providing sanctuary for immigrants. What none of them realized is that both of these groups were using the exact same principles to protect themselves, and both the right and the left are screaming, well, that's not what religious freedom is for. And to Professor Barclay's point, it's one common principle throughout that protects people in the exercise of their religion. And the only question, in my opinion, should be, is the government's interest compelling enough to override that protection? But it was the exact same principles, and you saw both the political right and left wanting that principle to be in place if it was a practice they agreed with, and not wanting it to be in place if it was a practice they disagreed with, which is really not a good foundation for religious freedom.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to conclude the event. Again, I just want to thank each of you, each of our panelists one more time for this incredible event. One thing that we have really focused on this year is civility and showing our own members, our own law school community about how we can talk about difficult issues in a very respectful way. And I appreciate the way in which each of you not only gave very insightful and articulate answers in your presentations and thoughts, but also how you each credited the good arguments on both sides of the political aisle, and how you presented a very fair argument. So thank you so much for setting a very high bar in more ways than one. And we hope that you come back when COVID's all over. Please come to Utah. I'd love to go skiing with any of you and be your Sherpa for the day. In the meantime, please take care. So thank you so much. We're going to dismiss everyone for classes now, and just want to thank our speakers.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
James,
for having us.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.